Hi, and welcome to today's episode of the Michael Yardney podcast, where we help property investors gain clarity in all the confusing mixed messages. We do this to help them develop the financial independence they're looking for by building a substantial property portfolio. Now, many of you who are regulars of this show know I run another podcast with Simon Kuestenmacher that we call Demographics Decoded. But every now and then, for all of you who don't follow that particular show, I also repeat that episode here on the Michael Yardney podcast. And I've chosen a particular episode today, which created quite a bit of controversy because it was about why younger generations are delaying home ownership. It created lots of comments on YouTube about me being an older baby boomer, not understanding the challenges of younger generations. Now, whether you're looking to buy a home, looking to buy an investment, or just interested in the markets, today's episode will be very valuable if you've got any interest in property at all, because it is a significant trend changing the shape of our housing markets. ABS data showed us that over half of millennials in the age brackets 25 to 39 are homeowners, compared to a larger percentage of those when they were that age. There were 62% of Gen Xers were homeowners when they were millennials' age, and in fact 66% of baby boomers. In other words, fewer young people are buying homes. Now, is it because of the cost of living? Is it because inflation? Is it because mortgages are harder to get? Look, there's no denying property prices have skyrocketed, but let's unpack what's going on. And as I said, you may not agree with our thoughts. I'm a baby boomer. Simon's clearly younger than me, and so therefore, let's see what we have to say. Let's get on with the show.
Hello, this is the Demographics Decoded podcast with me, demographer Simon Kuestenmacher.
And me, Michael Yardney, property and wealth creation expert. And this is the podcast where we unveil the trends shaping our future. Today we're going to be diving into a topic that's on the mind of many Australians who are following our housing markets. Why are younger generations delaying home ownership? Now, we've all heard about skyrocketing property prices and the challenges of securing a mortgage, but I think there's more to the story than just affordability. So, hi, Simon.
Yeah, so there are plenty of reasons to talk about why property has gotten more unaffordable, why the home ownership rates, especially in younger people, goes down and down and down. And yeah, it's obviously that particularly the younger generations have higher financial hurdles to jump over than the older generations. But generally speaking, we are shifting the way that we live our lives. And younger people increasingly have shifted away from these things. Sometimes we make this, it almost sounds like a cliche. We experience things rather than wanting to accumulate materialistic belongings. Of course, also we stay in education for much longer now. You start uni at 18, you end in your mid to late 20s sometimes. So then you very much value the flexibility of being a renter because you do not know which city you might be in 2 or 3 years' time. So that shifted that as well. And of course, young people very much have a different mindset in what they want out of their lives. What does success mean for a young person is different now than it was for their parents' generation.
Well, when we look at the figures provided by the Australian Bureau of Statistics, way back in the early 80s, close to 60% of, well, they weren't millennials then, but people in their 30s to 34-year-olds, I guess they were the millennials' parents, 60% or so owned their home or were buying a home, of course. In 85 to 89, it got closer to 65%. Nowadays, it's in the low 40%. And there's a number of factors. Clearly, affordability is an issue. In the early 80s, a median price home cost 2.6 times the median income. Today, it's something like 7 to 8% the median income. Of course, first home buyers are wanting something different to what they I guess their parents were prepared to accept. Do you really need to start off with a median price home when you're getting into the property markets? But there's lots to unpack. So let's start with what you initially started to mention, Simon. Affordability is cited as the main barrier to home ownership. But it's really more, well, there's also lifestyle changes involved, aren't there?
Exactly. And so when we talk about the most obvious two lifestyle changes, we realize that people stay in the educational system for much longer, and that they make babies much later in life. And a traditional point where you would want to switch from renting a property into owning your own property is when you start a family. And when you only start your family in your mid to late 30s, that's right about then when you actually need a home. So we push the need for home ownership further back. That definitely occurred. And that is, of course, linked with the idea that many of us stay in the educational system for longer and longer. By now, half of a year 12 cohort goes to university. That is gigantic. And so then you only finish your first degree when you're 22. If you do a second degree, you finish it at 24, 25. So it's only then when you really start adding to the workforce at scale, and you're not sure where your career takes you. Young people have actually no idea what city they will be living in 2 to 3 years' time. And so why would you bother really saving for a house then? And really that has been continuing the trend for the last 20 years, that had been intensifying. And we're now at a point where, as a young person, when you're by yourself, the idea of just buying a house has gotten so hard that we see, of course, people just saying, whatever, if I can't afford a house, I might as well double down on lifestyle and enjoyment of the moment, and we'll just see if something turns up later in life by dumb luck, so to speak.
Well, Simon, over the years, I've noticed the trend where younger Australians are prioritising experiences over assets. You already hinted at that beforehand. They're prioritising experiences over home ownership, and sometimes they're called snowflakes or flaky generation. It's very different to what their parents and their grandparents used to think important in their 20s and 30s.
Yeah, and I think, and this has to do with a fundamental question that people ask themselves. Where does the meaning of life come from? And for the grandparents' generation, it was easy. The meaning of life came from God. There was a higher power that provided meaning in your life. Now they're all atheists, so that clearly doesn't provide meaning in their lives. Their parents, however, they were already pretty atheistic, but they didn't need to, find meaning in life through seeking experiences, because they started families in the early 20s. So they only needed to fill their God-shaped hole in their soul with LSD for about 3 to 4 years after leaving high school. That was easy enough. If you only start families in your mid to late 30s, that's not a thing. So the meaning of life then must come from somewhere else. And this is where the whole narrative came from. It started really at scale with the millennials, where they said, hey, if I don't find meaning in religion, if I don't start a family, where does meaning of life come from? And so this is the generation that really pushed or popularized the idea of a gap year. You travel, you experience life. You go on yoga retreats to find your inner peace. You go on music festivals, you photograph your lunch. These are all attempts to provide meaning in your life. And of course, this is where the obsession with meaningful work came from, by the way, because it makes sense that why not look for meaning at the one place that you hang out for 8-9 hours a day? That's probably the most terrible bet as a generation that you can make, because how likely do you think it is that we can align our 14 million jobs in Australia with 14 million individual passions and desires? There might be an overlap, but that overlap won't be all that big. And so it's really a recipe for disaster on a population level. It's good if you get a job that is really meaningful to you. Congratulations. But overall, I think this has very much, there's a connection between this desperate search for meaningful work and terrible mental health data in young people. 1 in 4 women in their early 20s say they have a medically diagnosed chronic mental health condition. And we have millions of young people on antidepressants. It is a real crisis. And that's because we have deconstructed the idea of finding meaning in religion. We are not making families early in life. So we have not constructed a new thing that provides us with meaning. And to be honest, the young generations are struggling with that.
Well, I've heard you say that adolescence is lasting longer. What's your definition of adolescence?
Adolescence is essentially the stage before you reach adulthood. And adulthood is defined as you take responsibility for somebody other than yourself. So when I talk about adolescents, from year 30 or from age 13 to 35, they are of course at 35 fully fledged adults. They earn, an adult income. They had 35 years of life experience, but they didn't need to take responsibility for somebody other than themselves because they didn't go to the military where this is necessary. They did not make babies until their mid-30s. So you can continue to be a bit snowflakey, as the rather aggressive, simplification says. But I don't think that's per se an insult. In generational research, we also talk about the long life approach, meaning when you know that you live essentially forever into your 90s, then you hang out in each stage of the life cycle for longer. We often talk about stretching out the phase of the life cycle where we work. It's like, oh, we don't retire at 65 anymore. This will be pushed to 70 eventually. But we also stay in the other phases longer.
Now, Simon, one of the things that the younger generation seem to have is more career mobility, more flexibility. And I guess this is one of the reasons that they don't put down their roots early on, because they don't know where they're going to be. In the old days, you got a job, you worked there for 40, 50 years, you got that gold watch and maybe a little party if you're lucky when you retired.
Exactly. And we now have a higher share of the workforce is in jobs that are utterly, completely mobile. If you think about a knowledge worker, this job can be anywhere. And then your next career opportunity is probably not within this organization. If it's in the organization, you might just, go to the next level, but you move to another state. And so if you want to prioritize your career, this geographic flexibility can be very much in your favor. And young people do know this. And so it makes sense in the early 20s, mid 20s, even into the mid 30s. This is when you chase the next promotion, when from a pure career perspective, not work-life balance perspective, but career perspective, you're best served spending as much time as possible in the office, work as long as possible. These are the stages of the life cycle where they throw promotions at the hardest working cohorts, and you can then set yourself up for, higher incomes in your 40s and 50s. And that's best done by staying mobile. And so people reacted to that. And then, of course, because they rented for too long, so to speak, jumping on the property ladder in your mid-30s gets harder and harder. Because to be quite honest, your expectations are higher in your mid-30s than they are in your mid-20s. In the 20s, you can endure absolutely anything. But the older you get, the more a creature of comfort you become. And of course, young people do compare themselves to their parents. So if a 35-year-old, first-time parent looks at a house, they go, well, at 35, my mom, my dad, they already had 3 kids. They were close to paying off their mortgage, and they lived in a gigantic house. And so that then goes, settling for something less feels like, like a failure, like a disappointment.
I can understand that. So as we discuss the factors that are causing home ownership to start later in younger generations, I think many of the younger Australians prefer the vibrancy, the convenience of urban living. And that, I guess, comes at a higher cost. Inner city apartments and rentals, they provide the proximity to a lot of work, but there's also the cultural activities, the social scene. It was interesting on Saturday night, Pam and I drove down Chapel Street, Windsor, Paran, South Yarra, as we went up there and we were going to the movies, and there was all the young people congregating there. There were all the lifestyle locations, cultural activities, social scene. If people want to live in those areas so close to the CBD, that's much more expensive. I guess the trade-off between owning a suburban home and renting an apartment in the inner suburbs is something young people are now considering.
Absolutely. And you are better off in the inner city if you are still single, because your dating pool is bigger. This is where you go out to meet your potential partners in bars, and this is where the cultural events are happening. So if you're still looking for your partner, best settle in the inner city. That's that you have a better dating pool, so you stay there. And of course, since we partner up later in life, we are kind of forced to stay in this attractive area for the dating pool for much longer. You can completely skip the inner city lifestyle if you marry your high school sweetheart. But fewer and fewer people are doing this. If you marry your sweetheart at 18, 19, while you're at university, as soon as you're done with university, you can move to suburbia. If you don't go to uni, you go to suburbia straight after high school. So that is it's a, from a property perspective, it's a cheaper way of doing things in the long-term view. But the reality is it's increasingly a minority who is acting that way.
Now, Simon, in previous shows, we talked about the different skill levels. And again, it's not a judge of people, but some people who've been to university have got skill level 1 jobs, more knowledge-based jobs, and other jobs don't require as much training. Is there a difference in how people start on the property ladder, buy a home, settle down based on their skill levels and the sort of jobs they have?
Yeah, so I very much we see that the highly skilled knowledge workers, the uni educated folks, they tend to marry later in life, so they stay in the inner city for longer. Plus, their jobs are in the inner city. The office towers are in the inner city. Yes, working from home is a thing, but ultimately you still go to the office. So they settle there. If you are a tradie, which is by definition a mobile job, so your job site changes because you work on this construction site, then you work on that construction site. So these are people that have no need to settle in the inner city in the most expensive area. They can actually start settling on the urban fringe, because you need a garage that's big enough for your ute, so your tools don't get nicked at night. These kind of things. So they have a different property profile from the get-go. And it worked actually in the favor of tradies over the last couple of years. So the allegedly higher income earning skill level 1 knowledge workers, they had, structurally speaking, a couple of disadvantages. Ultimately, they still have a higher earning capacity, but they burn through an awful lot of their higher income, in a sense, with empty calories of rental fees.
Now, we spoke about delayed family formation a couple of times in this chat, Simon. How's this demographic shift affecting traditional home buying timelines and the types of houses that are in demand, the type of dwellings, I guess, that are in demand, because it's not necessarily houses?
If essentially the population as a whole does not move from the inner city to suburbia in the mid-20s, but only in the mid-30s, you need more rental stock. You need more apartment type stock in the inner city where all those people live. And what we've seen in the recent couple of years is that the biggest generation ever, the millennials, they're now making babies. That means they are, for the last 10 years, the biggest generation was in rental stock in the inner city. And now they're looking for 3 and 4 bedroom family size stock. So we have the biggest generation ever, all scrambling to find the same type of housing, which of course further drove up house prices for these type of homes. And so, yes, some people try to then just squeeze more time out of their small apartments by saying, yeah, if you just have one kid, you can kind of, before they get too mobile and agile, you can stay in the smaller thing for a bit longer, but not all that much longer. And eventually that then pushes things out, and the whole generation of millennials leaves the inner city behind. And the next generation that moves into those apartments, naturally speaking, is actually a smaller generation. So that kind of softens the apartment market a bit, structurally speaking. And it puts an awful lot of pressure on the family-sized housing stock.
Well, interesting that you say family size, because I found that while millennials want to live in certain locations, if they can't afford to, their biggest priority when choosing a home, Simon, is how many bedrooms they have. All of a sudden, they're now going to move out of the apartment and they're wanting at least one extra bedroom for the first child and figuring, hey, I'm not going to move straight away, so I better have another bedroom for the baby that's going to come down in the future, and maybe a media room as well. So you correctly said 3 and 4 bedroom homes are their priority.
Absolutely. And it's just the way that we changed preferences. about housing, that always is in there. And of course, everyone wants this, 7-bedroom, beautiful house at the beach with a pool for $500,000. But these houses don't exist. And so everyone needs to make some sort of compromise when they look for housing. But as you mentioned, the one thing that we are not willing to compromise on is the number of bedrooms. What's the last thing we're willing to compromise on? And so you'd rather move to a different property type. You'd rather move to a different suburb. But the number of bedrooms is crucial. And so that's what the whole millennial generation is doing. And if that's most important, it's also more important than tenure type, whether you own or whether you rent. So then people go, nah, I'd rather rent and have the right house for my family in the moment than to actually buy a house that is maybe substandard for me right now.
So, Simon, with this growing demand for rental properties, because the younger generations are renting for longer, especially in urban areas, how is this going to change the build-to-rent and co-living spaces, these new forms of dwelling that the government's trying to encourage construction for?
Yeah, so I think that the build-to-rent market will be a success. And I think that even those co-living arrangements are very much in demand. Because one thing that you risk by not having a family, by being single for longer, is that you feel lonely. And co-living as an arrangement, co-living, of course, essentially think of it as a university college type experience where you do have your own small apartment, but there is lots and lots of shared living spaces in an apartment. And these apartments are marketed and structured in a way that essentially everyone is roughly as old as you are and as rich as you are. There are no actual regulations about age and income or something, but that's what those areas provide. And I can see this is rather attractive. If you are a cashed up, urban professional, in your 20s and early 30s, you live in an apartment where everyone is a bit like you. These people have the same interests than you do. They might be part of your dating pool. So that can be a very attractive destination, and you're willing to pay a bit of a premium for this. And from a housing perspective, you can put more people on a smaller footprint, because they live in small apartments, they have shared kitchens and so forth. Ultimately, why the property investors like it is that you get quite a bit of bang out of your square meters that you offer to the market. The build to rent segment essentially ensures that we finally get institutional money into the rental accommodation provider here, because in Australia, it's roughly, 2.5 million mom and dad type landlords.
That's right. So it's really mums and dads compared to overseas, where institutions and corporations tend to provide rental accommodation, don't they, Simon?
Exactly. And now we figured, hey, if we have this crazy shortage of housing, it is much easier if we took if we invited players into the market that provide big housing stock at scale. So if you talk to a big super fund, they don't even consider building major projects if they are not worth tens and tens of millions of dollars, because it's too small. They don't build a townhouse here or there. They build big blocks and so forth. They buy and sell property portfolios rather than individual properties. And so inviting those people into the property market to ease the supply shortage is a very smart move. And I would also argue, that's a bit of an aside here, that there is political calculation behind this, because it's very, very hard, politically speaking, to manage 2.5 million mom and dad landlords. That is a bucket load of people. And if you do anything to make their main investment, a house, cheaper, they will not vote for you. Ask Bill Shorten about it, who lost the unlosable election a couple of years ago. So if you were, and we're oversimplifying this, if you were to take all of those mom and dad landlords away and you only introduced institutional investors, they would actually be much easier to handle politically. And I do think that the political class wants this as well. This is never mentioned. This is never written down anywhere. This is just my wild theory.
Having said that, these corporations are not going to invest in residential real estate unless it's profitable for them. At the moment, residential yields aren't high enough, so they invest in shopping centres, in office blocks, in industrial buildings, or in the share market or in corporations. So therefore, the government is currently giving them incentives, offering incentives, lower land tax, different stamp duties, other incentives to build. Having said that, that's not going to provide affordable accommodation, is it?
It's providing affordable accommodation insofar that it eases a bit of the supply shortage. So it does that. What it does not do is, because these are people who build housing not out of the goodness of their heart, but this is an investment, and there is a shortage along the full housing spectrum, from super fancy millionaire type houses to affordable and crisis accommodation. And who in their right mind would build at the low end of the market? The profits are tiny. This is a more volatile market at the moment. Building costs, construction costs, labor costs go up and down. So we talk about the flight to quality here, where it's best to build towards the top end and the middle end of the market and don't touch the bottom. Theoretically speaking, a state-owned housing developer could be doing this. And I mentioned it before. My secret bet was that under a Prime Minister Albanese, who grew up in commission housing, that we would see a state-owned housing developer. And this was a big fail, this forecast of mine.
Even though it would make a lot of sense to do that, the government post-war did a lot of development. They own land. They don't have to pay stamp duty. They could do it at scale. But I guess, like most things, they may not do it as efficiently as private enterprise.
Exactly. And even if they didn't do it efficiently, it doesn't matter, because they don't need to do this from a efficiency perspective. They don't need to be profitable. They can do this at a loss, which a private market could never do.
That's a good point. In the past, we've spoken about the importance of owning your home as a form of financial security, but with younger generations continuing to delay and some even foregoing home ownership, what are the long-term effects on the Australian housing market and our economy at large with this delay in Australians owning their own homes?
Yeah. So I'm personally not worried about people who do not own their own home, as long as they work. That's fine. You can kind of finance it and balance your life. That's okay. I'm worried about people who retire and do not own their own home. What I mean by this is your housing costs, if you rent, are very high, because you need to pay every month. You need to pay a relatively high share of your then shrinking income in retirement towards rent. That is expensive. If you own your property, meaning a fully paid mortgage of sorts, your housing costs are actually ridiculously small. And that's what you want. So the best buffer against poverty in old age is to own your own property. So what I would encourage, legal asterisks, this is not financial advice, what I would advise young people to do who live in in a rented accommodation, is to buy a 2-bedroom type retirement apartment that you could live in. Make sure it's in a walkable community, and start rent vesting. If this is at all doable for you. Yes, hopefully you can manage this property, negatively gear it, whatever. The most important thing is that you have a thing to live in once you're retired. That is absolutely crucial, because with the way that home ownership rates go, I'm quite worried about the bottom end of the market yet again. Because if we do not massively amp up housing supply, if there isn't an absolute bucket load of state-owned property that you can hand out to poor pensioners who do not own their house, which we won't have in my current reading of the situation, then there is just desperate poverty in old age, and that's something we do not want. Then you've all seen the documentaries, if you might have been to the US, where you have people in their late 80s packing your groceries at the supermarket because they need for $8 an hour or something like this. We do not want this in Australia, and property is the key to avoiding this.
Now, Simon, I know as a demographer, you're an advisor to organisations, to businesses and to government. And if people want to have you speak to their organisations, I'm going to leave a link in the show notes where they can speak to your team and organise it to see if that would be suitable for them. But my final question to you in today's chat is about governments. What role do you think government policies should play in addressing firstly, the affordability crisis, and then maybe even the lifestyle preferences regarding housing?
Yeah, so I would always ask government to stop doing harm. It's the medical premise of first do no harm. First home buyer grants, they drive up house prices. So stuff like this needs to be stopped. At the very least, do not proactively, artificially drive up house prices. That's the first thing. Sometimes these things are politically difficult. If we talked about reforms like, let's just kill stamp duty, introduce a land tax, that definitely lowers house prices, guaranteed. But the 2/3 of people who own their home will not vote for you. So it's politically impossible. But then, of course, I would seriously consider as a government to do at a very, very small scale, become a state-owned housing developer, meaning build a bit of housing and try it out. Don't invest billions in it straight away. Build a couple of properties, put them on the market, and ensure and write into legislation that there is a certain percentage of the national housing stock that needs to be state-owned. At the moment, it's something stupid like 3 or 4%. It should be at least 10%. And the rules would say before we reach this 10% hurdle, you're not allowed to sell state-owned property to the free market. We need to have a decent buffer in the system to make sure that the lowest income earners can live a life in dignity. And ultimately, we don't need to worry about low income earners because any kind of money that we give them, they invest right back into the economy because they don't save this money. They churn through it. So it's a nice way of stimulating the economy, actually. We're not just giving out handouts or something like this.
Now, Simon, I've been thrilled how well our Demographics Decoded podcast has been accepted by our audience. So thank you to all those people who are currently listening to us or watching us. We've been ranking amongst the top business podcasts on Apple Podcasts for a while now. But if you don't currently subscribe to this show or follow this show, depending upon what your app suggests, please just stop for a second and follow this show so that each week Simon and I can share our thoughts. Because Simon, next week I want to do something a little bit different. One of my favourite authors is Morgan Housel, who's a behavioural finance expert, and I'd like to just get some of your thoughts on some of his popular quotes about the way we think, because in general, when it comes to finance, but to many things, rational people aren't very rational, are we?
No, not at all. The idea to act rationally is much exaggerated, and we quite often fool ourselves into thinking that we actually are logical beings, but not really, to be honest.
Great. I look forward to hearing your thoughts about him then. Catch up with you next week, Simon. Thank you.
I'm looking forward to it.
This Demographics Decoded podcast was brought to you by Metropole Property Strategists. We provide a complete range of services to help our clients safely create intergenerational wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you're looking to buy an investment property or your next home, why not have a discovery chat with one of our wealth strategists? Go to metropole.com.au and explore your options. You'll find we're much more than just another buyer's agent. We provide a complete range of services, including property and wealth advisory, home buying, buyer's agency, property management, renovations, and development management services. The team will help you with frameworks that I've fine-tuned over 5 decades and we've been helping clients with for over 25 years. We're big enough to tip the scales in your favour, but still small enough to care. You can follow me on social media, but I suggest you also follow Simon Kuestenmacher. You'll find him regularly posting on all the social media platforms. I'll include links in the show notes. And thanks for spending the last little while with Simon and me. I hope you got some benefit from the show. And if you did, and you know somebody else who'd also benefit, please tell them about the Demographics Decoded podcast. There's a share button on every podcast app. You'll be doing them a favour. I hope you will anyway, and you're definitely going to be doing us a favour, helping us in our quest to make as many people as possible aware of the demographic changes that are going to shape their future. And of course, any of the discussion we had today was not personal advice about your future, but just general information to help inform you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Michael Yardney podcast, which was brought to you by Metropole, who help their clients grow, protect, and pass on their wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you like what you heard and don't already subscribe, you'll find us on iTunes or on your favourite Android app as the Michael Yardney podcast. Watch out for our next show, which comes to you twice a week, and you'll learn some new ideas about property investment, success, and money in around 30 minutes. To get more of Michael's thoughts, go across to www.propertyupdate.com.au and sign up for his daily morning briefing, and you'll hear from not only Michael but a group of leading property success and money experts. And just a reminder that the information you heard in this show today is general educational advice and not specific investment advice, as we don't know your personal circumstances. If you're looking for specific advice, why not ask the team at Metropole to help you?